Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, The Crisis of the Liberal World Order, which will be delivered by Martin Wolf. This semester's Stephen M. Kellen Distinguished Visitor. I want to just say I see a lot of friends who come to events on the Wannsee, so I want to thank you for trekking out here, if that's the right description. And to those of you who don't usually come to the Wannsee, I hope you fully appreciate that we're coming to meet you here. And happily so. It's great to be in Mitte. So this is the subject that we discuss over the dinner table every single night, and none of us would dare title a talk on this. And so although my staff has told me what might be in the lecture, I'm not going to presage it in any way whatsoever, and we'll see which of the superabundance of causes our distinguished speaker chooses to emphasize. Let me just say a word about the fellowship that brings Martin Wolf here. The Stephen M. Kellen Distinguished Visitorship honors the founding benefactor of the American Academy in Berlin, the German-American banker Stephen Kellen. Kellen was forced to leave Berlin in 1936 because of his Jewish heritage, but he remained deeply committed to the city all of his life. And he was, of course, one of the first financiers who worked again in Germany after the war, and companies such as Siemens owe a lot to him in terms of getting back on their feet. And he was also a great benefactor of the Berlin Philharmonic and its annual visits to Carnegie Hall. He was an ardent supporter of the American Academy from the very outset and remained so financially and intellectually for the remainder of his life. He spent time in the villa that is now the Hans Arnold Center. In fact, he courted his wife, Anna Maria Arnold, there. Later, he ran the family bank, first the Arnold Bank, Gebrüder Arnold, and then later Arnold and Bleichroeder, which he, as I mentioned, ran. We continue to be indebted to Stephen Kellen because he and Anna Maria provided the founding gift of the renovation of the Hans Arnold Center and also laid the basis for our endowment. And we are, although he is no longer with us, we're enormously grateful, and we take every opportunity to recall these events. I have a feeling that Stephen Kellen would have been thrilled to have Martin Wolf hold this lectureship, because he was very much a person who was attuned to the economic underpinnings of democracy and to the things that made for a lively and flourishing society. We have brought many people to Berlin as Stephen Kellen visitors, among them George Packer, the dynamic duo of journalists Susan Glasser and Peter Baker, and quite recently Mike Pyle, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics in the Biden administration. Just a bit of housekeeping. Martin's talk will be preceded by an introduction from Christine Wallach, trustee at the Academy, and someone we're profoundly indebted to for managing to get someone as in demand as Martin here. So thank you, Christine. His talk will then last about 40 minutes. It will be followed by some Q&A that I will kick off, and then the audience will have an opportunity to pepper him. And if you are here with us at the Kaiser and Friedrich Stiftung, please raise your hand to ask questions. And if you're joining via Vimeo, please type your questions into the Q&A part under the video screen. And now I will hand the podium over to Christina Wallich, who will deliver the formal introduction.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see you here. As Dan said, I'm Christine Wallach, and I'm a trustee at the Academy. It's a real pleasure, as a former colleague of Martin's at the World Bank, to welcome you all to tonight's lecture, and to welcome you, Martin, on behalf of the American Academy and your many, many friends in the audience. Dan's already mentioned the notable recipients of this distinguished visitorship, and it's very fitting that Martin joins this august group. In introducing Martin, I'll start with the basics. Most people here will know him as the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times, a role he's had for more than 3 decades. But describing Martin by his job title would be like saying Berlin's a nice city with a bit of history. It's technically correct, but wildly incomplete. So going beyond the basics, Martin's without a doubt one of the most trusted interpreters of how the global economy actually works and why it often fails. Readers turn to his column for information, but also for clarity. He has an unusual ability to take complex ideas born in academia and central bank conference rooms and to translate them into language that policymakers and laymen alike can understand, and without dumbing them down. The talent didn't come from nowhere. Martin's parents fled continental Europe in the 30s, and the remaining family didn't survive. This shaped in him an early awareness of social and democratic fragility and a self-confessed tendency, as he recently said, not to look on the bright side of things. Bad things can and do happen, and one ignores that at one's peril. Martin was born in London, built his career in the UK, studied classics, then PPE, and economics at Oxford. However, his perspective has always been global. Before joining the FT, Martin worked at the World Bank for over 10 years, at the time headed by Robert McNamara, where he focused on trade and country-level economic reforms in low-income countries. That gave him something that most financial journalists lack, a grounding in theory, but also in the institutional and political realities of how economic policies are made, negotiated, and improvised under pressure. To paraphrase Bismarck, it's sort of like making sausages. Better not to see it being done. I first met Martin in Delhi in the 1970s. We were both in the famed India division of the World Bank. He is the senior economist responsible for all policy work on India, and I as the junior new recruit. Back then, what struck me wasn't just his command of his subject, but his curiosity. That habit of serious listening, rigorous thinking, stayed with him throughout his career. As the FT chief economics commentator, the scope of Martin's writing is truly breathtaking. Over the years, he's written with equal authority about financial crises, banking system, inflation, central banks, globalization, trade, inequality, the fate of the middle class, Europe, the euro, I could go on, China, rise of emerging economies, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, what ties all these together is the idea that economics is never about the numbers alone, but about institutions and their governance, the exercise of power, and the lived experience of people and societies, who gains, who loses, and whether the system can ultimately command public trust. Fittingly, Martin was awarded a CBE, a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, in the 2000 New Year's Honours List for his services to financial journalism. He has 3 honorary doctorates at last count, and he also has 3 books to his name. The first, written in 2004, was written in the wake of the anti-globalization protests, and was a forceful defense of open markets, economic integration as drivers of growth and poverty reduction, with failures stemming from weak governance and bad domestic policies, not from globalization itself. 10 years later, Martin took a somewhat harsher stance, flagging in The Shifts and the Shocks how structural imbalances and poor governance, in particular financial deregulation, led to growing inequality, the 2008 crash, whose consequences we're still living with today. In 2023, the crisis of domestic capitalism took this even further to explore the growing tension between markets, politics, and social stability, showing how economic failures spill into politics and erode trust in democratic institutions. When large parts of society feel economically insecure and politically ignored, support for liberal democracy declines and opens the door to populism and authoritarianism, even in a country where this was once unimaginable. In short, Martin's arc has moved a long way from confidence in globalization and warning about systemic instability to very urgent calls for reform in the face of the crisis of the liberal world order. Please join me in welcoming Martin Wolf.
Don't really need this. So it's a great honor and pleasure to be here. Those were very kind remarks. I hope when my obituary comes to be written, they ask you. The only person who would have written a more generous one is probably my wife. It was an incredibly kind introduction, and it describes, I suppose, the trajectory of somebody who learns that what he thought has to be modified over time. And if you're a journalist, you can't avoid that, which is one of the really big advantages over being an academic. You can't go on being completely wrong forever, every week. It's too embarrassing. So you have to be open-minded to the possibility of being wrong, or indeed even the probability. Though, as I've always said before I start, I have tried to distinguish very clearly, and this lecture in a way fits into that, between core values, my core values, what I think matters about human society, what matter to me personally, which were basically the things I acquired from my parents, and my opinions about the world, how the world works. And I've defended my changes of view on how the world works by the simple proposition that if in the course of a professional life of nearly 60 years you've never changed your mind, then you just haven't been thinking. So what I'm going to do is talk about my current view on this subject, the crisis of the liberal world order. In other words, how did we get here? I'm not going to talk about where we go next, because perhaps that is for the Q&A. But clearly we are, in some pretty obvious sense, not where most of us, certainly I, expected to be 25 years ago, though since 2007, the surprises have diminished very considerably. And I think the core idea here is you cannot analyze the world, pretty obviously, of politics and economics in any way separately. And this, I think, leads me to consider lessons of the past which bear on where we are now. So I'm going to start with three quotations which in completely different ways shape my thinking. This is a quotation from a very, very dear friend whom you've never heard of. I suspect you've never heard of. Jan Tumlier was the chief economist of the GATT for many years. He was very influential in thinking about trade policy at a crucial period, namely when the Uruguay round began. He was a Czech. He died in 1986. And this is his most important remark to me. It's not true that we don't learn from history. We do, and then we forget. And I think that's a large part of what is going on. And we forget because we die and somebody replaces us. The second quote is pretty obvious, and it's pretty obvious what it means. I could have gotten an endless number of quotations from this fine gentleman, but it's a pretty remarkable statement, and it's not something that we would have expected of most presidents. At least they wouldn't have said it. And that's quite an important difference. And when he said it, almost no one was shocked. And the third quotation, actually, I've got rid of that quotation because I had to. I'd forgotten that. Come back to it later. So what I'm going to cover here is the following stuff. I'm going to talk about history rhyming, which is obviously taken from the famous remark of Mark Twain. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I'm going to talk about the way in which what's going on now rhymes with some things that happened about 100 years ago. Then I'm going to talk about where I think we are today, what's going on now. I'm then going to talk about how we got here. I'm going to talk about what's at stake today. And finally, I'm going to talk about what is to be done. And I do understand that all I'm going to cover in this very short lecture is insanely ambitious and so probably mostly wrong. But the core, I think, is correct. Otherwise, I wouldn't have agreed to make a fool of myself here. So let me start about history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So we've had a period of globalization and rapid technological change. No doubt about that. The globalization has been extraordinary. I will come to that in a minute. But that sort of period tends to generate huge changes in relative economic power, which are highly destabilizing. It leads to clashes between liberal and interventionist paradigms of how you deal with the consequences of those gigantic changes in relative economic power. It also creates profound social and cultural changes. And that happened between 1870 and 1914, with dramatic consequences for the stability of Europe and the world, and again after 1980. And we are again in an era of declining trust in liberalism and democracy and rising nationalism and populism. And that seems to me to have very close parallels with what happened in the period before and immediately and even more after the First World War. So that's my rhyme. So let me just start with, I'm going to describe this rather remarkable chart that I'll explain. So the chart shows the ratio of world exports of goods. I can't go further into all the components of trade otherwise, to world GDP back to the 1830s. And the first period is what is sometimes called the first industrial revolution, the period, the second industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution was in Britain in the early 19th century. The second industrial revolution was the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century, which brought electricity, the modern chemical industry, the internal combustion engine, radio, aviation, really important, clean water, though we knew how to do this before, rapid industrialization, urbanization, the rise of the working class, trades unions, and socialism. This was an incredible combination of transformations in the second half of the 19th and early 20th century. And it created the first globalization as well, because in addition to everything else, it was a period of relatively liberal trade, quite a lot of liberalization. And the reason I bring this in before you is that if you look at what's happened in the last roughly 80 years, but particularly the very recent past, you see that after a collapse in globalization in the interwar period, and of course during the war itself, to levels that would previously been reached in 1840, we had another dramatic period. First, the liberalization, which is among the advanced countries, which you can see up to 1980, and then the most remarkable period of globalization, what I think of as the second period of globalization after that period. And the question that one is addressing now, given the obvious crisis of this aspect of liberalization, it's only one aspect of the liberal order, but the one I'm going to focus on for lack of time for the moment, is whether we are about to have another collapse like the one that happened after 1914. Now, the second thing I wanted to show is that, and I don't think it's an accident, but I don't have the time to argue that this economic liberalism, which is shown so clearly in the globalization of the world economy in just this one metric, the ratio of world trade to GDP, correlates remarkably closely with the ups and downs of democracy. And I've written a whole book about why that connection exists, and I'm afraid I don't have time to go through the arguments then. I will just touch upon them a little. But the crucial point about this chart, so the brown line is from Polity4, one of the databases. It goes up to, in this case, to 2010. It shows the proportion of independent countries, obviously the number of independent countries changed over time, that were democracies. Could be plausibly be regarded as democracies. Elections mattered. I won't go into the definition. And the brown and orange lines are the equivalent of the ones I showed before. They showed in a slightly different way the ratio of world trade to GDP. And what emerges from this is in the period of globalization, I've shown there was a very rapid rise in democracy that hit its peak immediately after the First World War. In the interwar catastrophe, liberalization collapsed, trade collapsed to levels of extraordinary low levels, and so did democracy. There was a correlation between anti-liberalism, profound anti-liberalism, nationalism in economic policy with the anti-liberalism in politics. And I don't think that's an accident. There's a profound correlation, in my view, between the two. Then the subsequent period of rising trade, we see, particularly from 1970, a dramatic rise, reaching a peak in 2010, in fact, of the proportion of the world's regimes that were democratic, in which elections counted. And so again, just as in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, liberalization, opening of world trade, globalization, correlated with political democracy. It's a very remarkable correlation in my view. Now, what went wrong? Why was there this colossal collapse? And I'm going to argue it was because we couldn't handle, back in the early 20th century, there were many reasons, but I don't have time to go into detail more. But the big change was a staggering change in relative economic power. And that staggering change in relative economic power couldn't be handled within the institutional and political structure of that era. And the crucial transformation from this point of view was the rise of the US in the world, which is shown by the red line. It's the aggregate GDP at purchasing power parity at $2011, according to the Madison Project for the US, which is the red line. But equally important, because it completely transformed Europe, was the rise of Germany, the blue line, relative to the UK, which of course had been the forerunner of the Industrial Revolution and had been the principal liberal power economically. Obviously liberal imperialism, so it wasn't hardly liberal for the rest of the world, but it was very much the model of liberalism within context. And my view, these huge transformations in relative power became, in complex ways which I can't go into in detail, the shaping factors in the inability of Europe to stabilize itself in the following 30 years without US power. US power became, as a result, essentially of the rise of Germany relative, particularly to Britain, and its capacity as a power. Europe ceased to be self-stabilizing, and America became the necessary stabilizer of the European order. Now, the reason that's so important is this has happened again. So this is a slightly different measure, but here I show what has happened over the last 45 years in relative economic power. And here, for various reasons, I've used shares of world GDP because they're easily available. And the key thing here is what's happened with China and now India. So again, very similar to what we saw earlier with the rise of the United States. The United States, and to a lesser degree Germany, were the Chinas of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their policies were not so terribly different. I've got a discussion of that which I can't go into. Hamilton, List, industrial policy, the use of state power to catch up on the UK, all that stuff which we object to in China is what they did. There's nothing new about it. It's what successful catch-up countries do. China essentially did what the forerunners, the US and Germany in the 19th and early 20th century did. And China, of course, has been unbelievably successful, and at this measure has been the biggest economy in the world. There are alternative measures, but I think it's the best measure, the biggest economy in the world since 2015. And now we're seeing the same process occur with India, again, well behind, but it is already in this measure, and I think it's a very relevant measure, bigger economically than Japan, Germany, France, and the UK. A transformation of relative world power. And just as the British couldn't handle what was happening then, we are finding it incredibly difficult to handle what China has done. And that is, I think, particularly true in the United States, and is a very important part of the fear Americans feel about their present and future. In the first globalization, the US was an outlier with very high protection. This is the period that Donald Trump looks back to as a golden age. This, I can't go into this in detail either, undermined the commitment of other big economies, notably the UK, to free trade. By the late 19th, early 20th century, protectionism was becoming a very important theme, particularly imperial protection in the US. Very similar to what we're seeing now. Economic nationalism, a commitment to industrial policy, was not only characteristic of the US. As I've already mentioned, these ideas were also important among rising economic powers. Hamilton and List were, of course, the proponents of interventionism. Marxism and socialism also reshaped the political debate. Fundamental themes of anti-liberalism emerged in the course of the 19th and early 20th century. And I believe in today's world, China's success has reignited the same reactions. It's very similar reactions, and we can see that part of the anti-liberalism emanating from these profound shocks to competitiveness and relative power. So that's my incredibly brief discussion of where history rhymes. So where are we now? The first point I would make in my analysis of where we are now, as I've already mentioned, politics can never be separated from economics and vice versa. They are two sides of one thing. So you have to think about the two together. We are today in politically, so far mild, but decided democratic recession. This is what Larry Diamond of Stanford calls the political mood. I think that's now, he invented this term in 2006, if I remember correctly. I would now say we're moving into galloping democratic depression. People might differ on that, but that's very much where I think we are. Populism is on the rise, especially right-wing populism, which has fairly characteristic forms. It's nationalist. It often has a decidedly racist tinge. Nationalism is seen as associated with being of an ethnicity. It's obviously authoritarian, and it is profoundly hostile to constraining institutions, the rule of law, parliaments, and such election processes themselves. And of course, we can see that economic nationalism and interventionism are on the rise, and the most important case of this in the world now is, of course, the US. Back to this. And I think what we are seeing is an anti-liberal counter-revolution domestically, which has international consequence. As I said already, the most important reversal and the most important advanced reversal right now is in the US, which was, after all, the guarantor and creator of the post-World War II liberal order. I do not have time, but we might want to have questions about it, of what I mean by the liberal order. I'm going to assume everybody here understands what I mean, because otherwise I'm going to spend half an hour on explaining where it is liberal and where it is not. Now, I've talked about the democratic recession, and I think I have to put this in some context. So this comes from there are many versions of this sort of thing. This is from the VDEM database, and it's very up to date, which is used by this wonderful site, Our World in Data. And it tries to decompose aspects of liberal democracy into its component elements: the civil liberties of individual, judicial checks on government, legislative checks on governments, the rule of law, credible democratic elections, and that aggregates to liberal democracy overall. And there are two things that come out of this chart. We had this rise in the 19th century, which I've already described, particularly in the second half of the 19th century. You can see that very clearly. Then the collapse, then a slow recovery, reaching a peak about 2005, and then you see the beginning of this recession in most measures. It's not a catastrophe, but you can see the beginning of this. Personally, I think this measure slightly understates what's happening, but I don't have time to go into that. You can see very clearly a comprehensive set of shifts downwards. Now, as I've already mentioned, a crucial feature of our form of anti-liberalism is what's called populism, and particularly right-wing populism, though not only right-wing populism. This is what's shown in the purple area here. And I think it's important at this stage, though I don't have all that time, to define what this sort of study means by populism, because that's very, very important. This study, which I think is, which I'll come to a bit more about its conclusion, is by the work of three very remarkable German scholars. I think they're all at the Kiel Institute. I'm not absolutely sure at it. I know Moritz Schülerich is the head of the Kiel Institute, and he's a good friend of mine. And it's a paper they wrote, published in 2023, I think, called Populist Leaders and the Economy. And it's based on a sample of 60 countries, which they define as having gone through populist episodes, and it's very detailed. What's populism? It's defined, and I think usefully, as a style of democratic politics whose leading idea is hostility to all, but often different, depending on whether it's left or right, elites. It's a politics whose definition is elites are the enemy, trust me, I, the great leader, represent you, give me all the power, and only then, with all the power, can I defeat the predatory elites. And of course, right-wing populists and left-wing populists tend to have different views of who those elites are. You can easily see that, but they share this idea about the need for concentrated arbitrary power in the hands of the leader and those around him, almost around him, and the ability to suppress and destroy the elites. On the right, this is often associated also with hostility to people perceived as outsiders to the community, not proper members, namely ethnic minorities, and often intellectuals with what they think of as funny ideas. So this is what this study and many others define, how they define populism. And you can see, crucially, that wasn't so clear from the previous writing on the previous measures from VDEM on backsliding, that we have reached an extraordinary high level of populism by historic standards in a proportion of countries in the world over the last couple of decades. So I think that's a very useful way of thinking about it. It's not perfect, but very useful. Now, this is one way of thinking about, well, is Trump populist? And I'm just focusing on him because he's the most important. So this is one measure, set of measures of the form of government that I've just described, of what a demagogic leader in power wants to do. And the really remarkable thing is how radically aggressive in his second term, this was just after the first 7 months of the administration. For this purpose, I haven't been able to go back further in this time, but you can see an explosion by him of rule by decree in response to and again, very classic of such a figure. I don't need to explain that in Berlin, I think. He declared 10 national emergencies in the first 7 months of his government. Over the southern border, over drug cartels, over energy policy, over drugs from Canada, over drugs from China and drugs from Mexico, over the International Criminal Court, over trade imbalances, of course, and we know that recently the Supreme Court ruled against it, but he's gone elsewhere. And of course, a national emergency over Brazil's persecution of its ex-president for trying to seize an election. That was a national emergency in the US. And the result is this explosion of executive orders, which is an explosion of essentially arbitrary government. Government without legislation and government without law. It's much worse now. And the second bit of support I want to give you for this idea that there is a really colossal process going on here. This comes from my brilliant colleague, John Murdoch, who has shown in this chart in particular, he's done a wonderful thing. He's done very complex work, I can't go into all this, in measuring the amount of democratic backsliding in countries we know have gone through dramatic democratic backsliding over the last 12 years or so. These are Hungary, Venezuela, before Maduro's exit, I don't think that makes so much difference, Russia and Turkey. We can disagree about the levels, but you can see very clearly the story. What he points out that in Trump's second term, the deterioration has been faster and bigger, faster than any of those countries. So this is emergency level backsliding, and that's completely consistent with what I showed you forward. Domestic transformation in response to this form of politics explains a lot, is very clearly on the rise. This, however, there isn't just something going on in the US. I said I wanted to talk about the global liberal order. Well, one of the features of the global liberal order was certain rules about how we would treat trade policy. And all I want to show here, I don't want to go into whether these are good things or bad things, but if you look at this, you can see that in the last 5 years, the number of trade policy interventions, which at least for the people who write Global Trade Alert are harmful, I don't have time to go into that, has doubled. And it was already much higher in the previous 10 years than it had been before for 30 years. So we can see in a completely different way the rise of executive orders across the world to basically redirect, rejig, transform trade has also exploded. A different measure of anti-liberalism. It's a theme of mine that domestic anti-liberalism and international anti-liberalism go together, just as they did 100 years ago in Europe. Now, how we got here this time. Liberal globalization first creates opportunities for rapid catch-up growth, and then countries that caught up start to go ahead. The West was that region once, and now it's the victim of these changes. Now, that leads to transformation, further the domestic political changes, and that's what I want to talk about now. Democracy and capitalism are always a difficult marriage. So what has happened, just as they did, in my view, in the late 19th, early 20th century, I don't have time to explain this in detail, but technological and social change have been causing gigantic upheavals in our domestic social and political structure with political consequences we can identify. So what are these changes? Growth has slowed. We have rapid deindustrialization. We have low fertility, aging, and pressures for mass migration into our societies. We have personalized media which transformed the consumption of information, and we have AI which is going to transform economy and society further. I don't have the time to go through this, but changes happened in the late 19th, early 20th centuries which also had profound transformational effects on our societies, which were almost equally difficult, perhaps even more difficult to manage. And so our political, economic, and social institutions are struggling, and the crises that I've shown to democracy and the way our politics are working are, I think, a reflection of that. So how we got here. I've suggested already that the marriage of democracy with plutocracy, or capitalism with its tendency to generate vast wealth, has always been difficult. The history of complex societies has always been one of extreme inequality of political and economic power. That's how societies after the agricultural revolution tended to develop. Walter Scheidel explains that wonderfully in his great book, The Great Leveler. Equally naturally, these two were married to each other. Power gave wealth and wealth gave power. So historically, in the pre-democratic era, before the democratization of the 19th and again, second half of the 20th century, the natural structure of society seemed to be power gave wealth, wealth gave power, and society was incredibly hierarchical. The rise of democracy changed that, at least in theory. And what I won't have time to discuss why democracy rose, discuss that in my book, but when we ended up with then is our system of democratic capitalism is a complex and difficult marriage of what I call complementary opposites. They need each other in some important ways, but the inequality that capitalism tends to generate undermines confidence in democracy and creates this tendency to go for what I tend to think of populist plutocracy, plutocratic populism. So now, today, gigantic wealth has returned, a lot of it because the policies and economic developments I've discussed, and with it has come plutocracy. And given the need to placate and manage the masses, quote unquote, in our society, so has that charismatic autocracy. Charismatic autocracy is the way we manage a highly unequal society in which we are committed, at least notionally, to democratic elections. And that's, I think, why we've ended up with the sort of politics we now see in the United States. Now, I just want to indicate very quickly, and I'll go through it very quickly, some of the profound transformations that have occurred in our society, which will explain the dissatisfaction of so many people with the conditions of their society and the anger they feel at elites, which leads them to choose demagogic populists. This is just illustrates the profound change in growth. So the dark blue column shows the rate of growth of GDP per head in these countries between 1980 and 2007. The light blue shows the rate of growth between 2007 and 24, and the red column shows the change. Now, basically, what you take from that, the US, is there's been a dramatic decline in growth rates across our economies. We're not getting richer as we used to. That's one big source of unhappiness. The second huge change is deindustrialization. The old days of a large industrial labor force have now gone. This has had profound social and political effects, and particularly significant, in my view, is the associated decline or disappearance of the countervailing power of trade unions, as J. Kelly Galbraith talked it. And this here, just look at the pink columns, that's how much the share of the labor force in industry has declined over the period 1970 to 2023. These are very, very big shifts in the labor force. In some cases, France and the UK, quite astonishing ones. The US is not exceptional. This is universal across developed world. And the third big transformation, which we find incredibly difficult to manage, is this huge rise in the proportion of populations that are foreign-born, which we have mostly handled, I think, very badly. That varies. I'm not suggesting, by the way, there's any clear rise between the extent to which not foreign-born increased in our populations and xenophobia, but it's certainly caused, in my view, considerable turmoil in our politics, and you can see this shown in the outright racism of much of our right-wing politics in many of our societies, including, unquestionably, Britain. So let me move on very close to the end. What is at stake? Basically, my argument here is we are in an era of revolutionary upheaval, as happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and on into the middle of the decade. This revolution undermines prospects for four fundamental aspects of the world we used to think we lived in: democracy, prosperity, I've discussed that, peace, because of international cooperation is broken by these huge shifts in power, and just the cooperative process itself, what we thought the UN and similar bodies were about. And the result of this, if you look at a detailed analysis of the state of democracy, this is a much more detailed analysis than I had earlier on. We just looked at overall amounts by extent to which elections mattered. What you can see is a huge rise in the number of countries that are electoral to some extent, but what is very, very clear that what they call liberal democracies, ones with all the rules that I have discussed, basically us, the West, are now going through very significant decline, and a lot of them are becoming electoral democracies in which the rule of these rules, institutional rules, have become very, very weak. Now, what is at stake now in this counter-revolution as I've described it? Well, one is simply prosperity. This is a second chart I've taken from Schullerich and others, and basically what it says, what it shows, if you look at it, these indicate what, I won't go through the statistical analysis that they use, but basically what they say, what is the effect of these sorts of populist governments on prosperity? When they operate in the way they do, outside the constraints of all the institutions that have been built up to sustain a liberal system, what happens? Well, the answer is dramatic declines in prosperity, which accumulate over time. They damage the independent technocratic institutions of government, fiscal and monetary stability, the rule of law, and stable long-term expectations. More extreme populist regimes are fascistic. These assail science and most forms of independent inquiry. And what you get from this, very clearly from this analysis, is long-term damage. And it is important to remember that despite, and coming back to my point about why globalization works. This is why I wrote Why Globalization Works. The era of globalization, and I've shown how dramatic it was also the period in which the world experienced by far the largest rise in prosperity in history. By far, incomparably much greater than in the period from 1800 to 1950. The average world GDP per head after World War II, according to the Madison Project, rose 5 times. And by the way, the fastest rise was in the developing world, not in the developed world. And that was a great achievement. What we are losing, for a whole set of reasons I've tried to explain, some impossible to deal with, some difficult to deal with, some huge mistakes. What we are losing is something that was sensationally successful. And I think there is more that's at stake than prosperity. The move back to a world of interventionist great powers pursuing self-interested policy is likely to be a move to a world of war. We've already seen it in Ukraine and the Middle East, and I wrote this before, what's just happened in the last few days. And war is not only physical, war can also be fought with tariffs, sanctions, and other costly means, and this is what is now happening. And the objections of war will also frequently be economic, as well as more narrowly those of national security in the traditional sense. War cannot be separated into the economic and the political. It's both. And the very last thing, the final things that is at stake in these transformations, as I've tried to summarize them, is the ability to cooperate. One of the main themes of post-war II order was one of institutionalized international cooperation. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we thought this had become global. But the aim of that was shown in the creation of the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, the GATT and the WTO, don't know why I lost that T, the World Health Organization, Climate Change Conference, etc., etc. The key idea was that we needed to cooperate in order to provide global and regional public goods. And this is, of course, radically inconsistent with the world of competing great powers under the control of great leaders, accountable to nobody else, and not even accountable really to anybody within their own country. And yet that is also the world we're moving into. And so development, climate, trade, and health cooperation are also now at risk. So what is to be done? Very last chart. Mark Carney, Canadian Prime Minister, called for middle powers to respond to what he called the rupture. We can't influence what's going on in the superpowers. Perhaps we can do that. And I have argued in my most recent column on this subject that the EU has a unique potential role as leader of the world's middle powers. It is clear that many of the world's middle powers do not wish to follow the US in its inward-looking, anti-liberal world system direction. But they need to be helped. And this gives the EU, a Pacific economic giant, a new potential role in the world. But if it is to play that role, it must become stronger and more independent, internally and externally. Is this possible? But where I conclude is that if there is hope, and I tend to be very pessimistic these days, a remarkable amount is going to depend on where Europe decides to go. Thank you for listening.
So this is where I don't tell our speaker that we're going to have to kidnap him and hold him hostage for a long period of time to talk about all those things that he didn't have time to talk about. How do you feel about a month at the Academy? A fantastic, spectacular discussion that has left my head spinning. And so the first question I would ask is, given the rapidity of change and the very clear and I think correct prediction you made that populism brings us a decline in prosperity, shouldn't this be a self-correcting problem if we remain in the zone of political scientists have different words for it, competitive authoritarianism, as long as there are still elections, shouldn't we bounce back from this fairly soon?
So that's, I think, a very important question, and I have two answers to that. First, one of the most interesting things about that piece of research and similar pieces of research is that it turns out to be very difficult, not impossible, to get rid of this sort of authoritarian populist regime. And I think the main reason is they rig things. And they rig things quite cleverly. You don't have to rig things colossally. You don't have to suppress elections altogether. Relatively small amount of rigging, carefully targeted, can achieve quite a lot. And though I didn't have time to discuss this here, you have a pretty good set of a good example of this in a small country called Hungary, where we're going to see, because it's very much a live issue, whether an election can reverse it. The basic story is talented demagogues, and you should never underestimate them, do understand what they have to rig. But they often find it difficult, because politics is still politics, they're not autocracies, to go that far. So you have to hope that the revulsion of the people is sufficient to overcome the ability to rig. But here, there's important to remember one other thing, which is, I think, Hannah Arendt point. A lot of people do well out of this sort of regime. They get into many places, often which they would never get to on their merits, and they are very loyal. And many people get very rich as a result of these sorts of regimes. And their resources are used to, or directly given, to control media, for example. So in these various ways, successful demagogic populist regimes are extremely successful in perpetuating themselves. And finally, if you get a cycle of these regimes, the people tend to give up because they come to the view that nothing makes any difference. And that once you get that, then they don't really trust anybody who says it can be fixed. And that, I argue this, but they argue, is part of the story of what happened to Argentina.
Okay, well, that cheered me up. Relatedly, when...
You're right, it's just not simple.
No, I know it's not simple, but when I look at what is going on in what Eurocrats call the country I know best, my own, I see that the man who ran on the No Forever Wars ticket and who brilliantly exploited the failure of the American elite in Iraq and Afghanistan has just committed an extraordinary folly, which seems to completely give the lie to what he ran on, and he doesn't seem to know where he's going. It would seem like it is a perfect refutation of the populist elite following the refutation or disqualification of the traditional elite. So since you wrote your column about Iran, tomorrow's column, what do you think?
Well, one of the characteristics that comes out of the literature in this is that populist leaders tend to be very willful, unstable, unpredictable, and, to use a word, nuts. Now, this is not I can give many examples, but this is a very, very good example. And they do things that really and truly nobody had expected. The characteristic of this leader, I think, is his ability to recognize that what seemed a great, great idea yesterday, is actually no longer a great idea, and he just gives it up. His reversals are remarkable. So I think it's perfectly possible, and this is what I suggested, that a few days from now, he will say, well, this war was a colossal success. We sorted everything out, and we are going back home, and I'm never going to talk about Iran again, and you don't need to think about it anymore. Go pat them on the head, and the people will all go back home and forget all about it. And it is remarkable how good he is at that. So he's not committed to anything he did yesterday, or even an hour ago. This flexibility, which comes from the complete absence of principle, is a tremendous advantage in modern democracy and should not be underestimated.
So I spoke to someone in the Defense Department very recently, an old acquaintance who said to me, you can argue whether we needed to go after Iran or not, but I'm pretty sure this is not the right president to have done so. And I think that I took that exactly as agreeing with your statement.
Can I just argue against that?
Yeah.
So, from my perspective, I love the country you know best. I have loved it. I've lived there for a long time. So. The US has a long and undistinguished history after World War II of getting involved in and committing resources, treasure, lives to long and futile wars. And most of them, it was completely obvious. I mean, I was around during the Vietnam War, and I thought it was crazy from the beginning. So the problem with them is they were consistent, serious men, and their successors were consistent and serious men, and they had the view, well, we've invested so much in this, we can't possibly admit it was all a terrible mistake. Let's up the ante and do it properly. Now, you think about Vietnam, you think about Afghanistan, you think about Iraq, very similar. So I think maybe if you've got a presidents who decide to do idiotic things, having somebody who doesn't give a damn about what he did yesterday may actually be helpful, because you've done an awful lot of the opposite. And I look at some of these people, Mr. Obama over Afghanistan, for example. I won't go into the whole Vietnam. So maybe this is not the worst thing. He does idiotic things, but then he just moves on.
Right.
This comes down to the problem. Democratic leaders can really be leaders can be very bad, even if they're basically quite intelligent and decent people. It's one of the most depressing things about reality.
Of which there is no shortage of depressing.
Of course he shouldn't have done what he's just done. Yeah. But I can perfectly well believe that 5 days from now it will be as if it never happened. I'm not predicting that, but my column does, by the way. But the point is, never underestimate the ability of this man to forget what he did yesterday.
Yeah, not a proponent of Colin Powell's Pottery Barn law. Yeah. If you break it, you own it.
Yes.
Right.
Well, but Colin Powell and his president were serious people. And of course he thought that, because if you break something, you're morally responsible for it, and you just can't walk away. It would be a bad thing to do. But that's a problem for people with some sense of morality.
Right, a huge impediment to a good career. Okay, I have many more questions. I could ask questions all night, but why don't we open it up to the audience? Please raise your hand, have a question mark after the question, and wait for the microphone. We have one right over here. It's on.
Okay, thank you. I completely agree with your rhyming analysis. I also completely agree with your last slide about Carney and the project and the role of Europe for the middle powers. One thing I didn't hear, and I wonder whether you deliberately left it out, you think it's not important which I also think is different from the first time around, is a structural change in demography. I didn't hear the word demography at all. And aging society have a few characteristics, and this is really new in world history, that we are becoming rapidly aging societies, not just in the developed world, but increasingly also in the developing world. The crisis of fertility, etc. These societies become increasingly risk averse. They have a very high discount factors, and that means they don't invest. They don't like to do reforms because, after all, painful reforms is, it's like an investment. And that means, as a consequence, that democracies, because they can't reform themselves anymore, are increasingly viewed as dysfunctional or not as functional as they need to be and could have been, in particular in comparison to functional autocracies like Singapore, China, etc. So that seems to be a new structural phenomenon to me that sort of summarizes a lot, and also the inability of democracies to pull themselves out of this mess. So question, why did you leave out demography?
I don't probably have the time. Well, first of all, in the last month, I've written, which is fairly exceptional, 3 successive columns on demography. And it's an issue of which I'm profoundly aware. I left it out because I already had far too much. I mean, it's pretty obvious that I galloped through the whole world history of the last 200 years from multiple dimensions. And if you follow what I say, then you are really, really smart. Because I've been working on this for years and I found it difficult to follow. So the answer is I couldn't put more in. Now, that's the first point. Aging creates a whole slew of problems. One I did touch on, immigration. But the simple answer is I couldn't have dealt with this in the time available. And I don't think it is as important as some people think for the problem you mentioned, though it's not unimportant. Let me just... we do save and invest quite a lot. Our investment rates actually haven't fallen that much. The return of capital has. That may be due to innovation, which is something else, then gets into the nature of technical progress and things on which I thought a lot, which I don't think is directly related to demography. But it's clearly, it creates some serious problems for fiscal management and so forth. Where I differ with this view, and this is why it would be more difficult, is I think the autocracies have extreme problems in managing response to change, which in my view are even worse than ours. Singapore is sui generis. I mean, I do really think it is. But if you look at China now, I think what we're seeing in China, I know this will be incredibly controversial, is premature senescence. That is to say, they are making colossal errors, which are undermining the rate of growth. I've written about this for 20 years. And they're doing so because they are losing the whole feedback process in the system. And because Xi is much more stubborn and inflexible than Dong was, this creates ossification. And the most extreme example of bureaucratic ossification in an autocratic regime in my lifetime was Brezhnev's Russia. So while I agree with you, we have a big problem. In my view, their problem is even bigger. So then comes to the question, well, what do we do about this in a democratic system? I have a very simple view which I put forward, which is which was wildly unpopular when I first put it forward, is all parents of children should have 2 votes for each of their children, which weights properly their weight in the future. And that will be completely transform the democratic, because children are unrepresented. That would be quite important. simple question.
Oh, well.
Great, thanks so much. Just a very quick question with regards to just your last point. I think in the US that ever since 1968 or so, barely half of 18 to 24-year-olds have actually voted. And so that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges is that people who are over, say, 50, 60, et cetera, they're at about 72 or 73%. Very consistently, there was quite a big bump with regards to Obama and also Bush 2. One question, actually two very brief ones. Do you think the midterms can somehow turn it around? That's one. And two, this aspect of the business case. There is a business case in voting, and there's a business case in, shall we say, leaving money on the table by not voting. Is there, I mean, one perfect example of that, I think, is Nigeria. You had an election in 2023. The winner won with 9 million votes in a country of 215 million people. And there were a lot of, and a decent candidate only got 6 million. So he was a few million away from potential transformation. Thanks.
Two questions. I'll just focus on how do we get more people to vote? I think was a key question. Well, I think the Australians have the answer to that. It's compulsory. And it seems to me it's a civic duty, and if it's a real civic duty, it should be compulsory. I'm not that liberal. You should pay a price. You've been given something incredibly valuable by the struggles of your ancestors, forebears, and so on. You should use it. The midterm question is to me, it's very simple. It is actually a bit of an equation in a sense, which is the hostility to what the government, the party in power is doing, going to be large enough to offset the efforts of the party in power to rig the election? And I think at the moment, I am open-minded on the answer to that question. There is no doubt at all that there will be a very serious effort, is a serious effort, and will almost certainly become more serious to rig the election. And there are so many ways you can do it. It isn't an accident that the President referred to the important task of ensuring the security of elections by, quote unquote, nationalizing them. You know he has said that, and you know what that means. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that this has not been a very successful administration, and it's done a lot of things, looking at the polls, that lots of Americans are very, very angry about it. So the question, which of these will win? And I don't know. Obviously, I don't know. I'm not even in the country. When I read what's going on, I've taken the view, can the Democrats regain power and use it well enough to change the subsequent election to be convincing as an opposition, which is very important, if they were to control the House and possibly the Senate even? Well, I don't know. But I do think the next two elections, this round and the presidential election, are arguably, I won't say the most important elections in American history. The lead up to the Civil War was clearly, but they are unbelievably important, not just in American history, because of the role of America in the entire world.
Yana, the woman with the blue.
Hello, and thank you for your remarks, especially in such a limited amount of time. I was just hoping you could clarify a point you made earlier. You mentioned, or you identified income inequality as a characteristic of declining democracy, and also on the populist side of things, that anti-elite protest was a characteristic of both left and right populisms. So I was wondering what you think paths forwards are for kind of reestablishing income equality in societies, and as part of that, what you make of the work of Gabriel Zucman, an economist working on progressive taxation.
So in my book, I have quite a lot on this. It's a very complicated topic. There are 2 points to make. I think quite a bit of the increase in income inequality has been the result not of rigging, though that's important, of the system, but of very powerful economic changes. Strangely enough, the economic growth in our societies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s was equalizing, and what has happened since has been just the nature of technical progress and the way it worked and what trade did was disequalizing. And of course, trade played some role in that. I mean, you can't have the China shock without changing relative wages. It was, if I haven't done it, but this is relevant to Germany. When you think about what happened in the late 19th and early 20th century from a trade point of view, was the incorporation into the world of the infinite land resources of the New World. And the reaction of that was in agricultural protection in Europe. Inevitable. What we did with China was incorporate 1.4 billion people into the world, and very remarkable. And that, of course, had an effect too. And then the question is what you do about it. I don't think Trump's tariffs will improve equality. I can go into why, but I really don't think they will or can. So you have to use more direct measures. And I think the sorts of things that Zuckman and others have talked about, and I do have a section, are worth considering. The use of the fiscal system to create dramatic shifts in inequality of income is, I think, of limited effectiveness, but you can certainly achieve very large shifts in the distribution of consumption, which is quite important. But the forces you're operating against are obviously incredibly powerful, not least, a whole range of it, but not least because particularly in the US system where the problem is particularly great, the political system overweights the power of the very rich. And that makes it very, very difficult to win elections on these sorts of premises. I mean, the US has more or less eliminated death duties, for example. There was no call for that from the people, but there was a call for it from the people who were the donors. So there's a political question of whether democracy can deliver on such measures, even if the majority wanted it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for a very interesting lecture. And you ended by saying that Europe is probably the convening force of the middle powers. And I agree with you, but it's interesting to hear that from someone from the UK, and we know about all the problems of coordination and actual political will and political forcefulness in the EU. So what is your recommendation, or where do you see Europe going, or how do you really have any hope that this will materialize?
Well, I have two answers on the British role. I'm pretty well known as having been violently opposed to Brexit, which I thought was staggeringly stupid, but for us, damaging to Europe. But I suppose the only argument, I've made this remark often, the only advantage of having Britain outside is that one of the most recalcitrant members have been removed. So there's one excuse for not doing more among the Europeans. You can't blame it on the Brits anymore. However, it's turned out that you've got quite a few recalcitrant members left. And that's then gets to the second point. I don't know. So as far as the future of Europe is concerned, it seems to me there are two opposing forces. Europe confronts objectively, and this is what I was trying to describe, a crisis, a genuine crisis, in that the world on the basis of which Europe has made its political and economic future no longer exists. And once you realize that, you have to do something. So that's the objective situation. On the other hand, precisely because you're in such a situation, because of the results of that, politicians have less credibility. And there are very powerful forces within European countries of people who basically say you can't trust any of the political leaders, and particularly the political leaders who would just say just this. And the Trump and his people are very aware of this and are very enthusiastically promoting the cause of the people who take the opposite position. So the question is, who is going to win? as an objective analyst, I would say I'm not very optimistic. But I think people have to recognize that the world that Europe thought existed doesn't exist, that it is quite possible the America they wanted will never come back. And this is a very unfriendly world, and Europe has to be transformed. I have no idea whether that will be possible, and I wish everybody involved success.
Sabrina, right here.
Thank you so much for the talk. So about 2 years ago, the Financial Times had this figure that was went viral, which was the gender divide increasing in South Korea, US, Germany, and the UK in terms of conservative versus liberal ideology, you may recall. And in the US, the cohort, the youngest, the 18 to 24-year-old cohort is more conservative than the boomers. There's nothing wrong being conservative, but that conservatism is associated with the right wing. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about how much of this gender divide in ideology might play a part in going forward in the solution.
I don't know how this will play out, because to me it's, given my generation, God, I'm old for a boomer, very old for a boomer. In fact, I'm the oldest boomer you can possibly be. So you can't imagine how remote this is. I can't even imagine a world in which men and women have different political ideologies because they're men and women. We had lots of problems that wasn't it. So, but it's pretty obvious that politics, because I've been reading a lot about it, there is clearly a profound manosphere aspect to the right, with a virulent misogyny, and obviously the opposite side, and a political movement. I mean, didn't have time to do it, but obviously one of the things about the new right is it's violently reactionary in these respects. Well, that's terrifying. It reopens a whole set of issues, race, gender, which I really thought had been closed, had been resolved. So that's frightening and terrifying. And the only other point I would make is if people at that age are living in a world in which young men and women, obviously for me, they're the age of my grandchildren. My oldest grandchild is 18. They can't sit in the same room or at a table and talk to each other in a civil manner because they disagree about everything fundamental. Then all I can say is, well, if you've got a reproductive future as a species, it's going to have to be through mechanical wombs, isn't it? I mean, this is it. And it depresses me almost as much as the future of the world run by AI. So my feeling is, thank God I'm going to die soon.
Just a last question, Ariel.
China has been pretty consistent over the last 35 years. If you were to go back in time with hindsight, would you have dealt with them differently in the 1990s and the 2000s?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And the answer is yes and no. But let me separate out the elements. For the last 20, this is going to go down really well here in Germany. So let's make comprehensive enemies. So I have taken the view since the beginning of this century that we cannot handle, and this is a view in which I follow John Maynard Keynes, who I know is seen as a pretty unacceptable figure by most German economists, but the huge current account imbalances are impossible for a open world system to handle, and that applied to Germany, and it applied to China. China's a bigger problem than Germany because it's bigger, but basically, in my humble opinion, Germany blew up the Eurozone economy. So this is a general remark. So global imbalances, and Keynes was very clear about that, were really important. And if the Americans had focused on that issue and that issue alone, over 10 or 15, 20 years, they might have been able to fix it. Because I think they were right. We can discuss at great length whether we agree on that, but that's my view. We should have done that. And I've been fairly consistent on that. Now, the more interesting question is, do I think that the fundamental reason that China's attempt to acquire know-how from the rest of the world and develop was illegitimate? No, because everybody's done that in the past. I've already discussed that. Do I think the desire to make people of China vastly richer was illegitimate? Certainly not. I think that they have the right. Do I think we could have dealt with some of the associated behavior and the problems it was causing from about over the last 20 years, particularly? That I think yes. And the way to have done that would have been for the West to have agreed that we need pretty fundamental changes in important areas of trade rules, which we will agree on and we will work on. And it would have started by saying, probably about 2000, China, yeah, we know you're quite poor, but you're not a developing country, not in a relevant sense. All of that could have been done, in my view, if Western policymakers, both the current account thing and this, had recognized there was a serious problem and it needed an intelligent technocratic solution, which was imposed on China. And the Chinese would, of course, have had to accept it. So I don't think that's how far I would have gone. I would not have abandoned the whole system, and I would certainly not have said to the Chinese, we are going to do everything we can to stop your development. I wouldn't have gone along with that, and I think we have to accept the consequences. My view is the Western countries, 12% of the world population, this is in all my books, is that could not have been entitled to me to rig the world system to prevent development. I believed in development, and I still do. But a lot of the things China did, we could have dealt with and would have made it much harder to handle. But in the end, we probably would not have been in a place that different. Once the Chinese worked out how to do the stuff we do, even if we try to stop them, and the Americans are really trying, or have been trying quite hard to stop them, they can't be stopped. They just can't. The one thing I've learned from my endless trips to China and wandering around, of course you can't stop them.
Martin, thank you so much for a dazzling talk and for helping us fulfill our founder's charge to bring the most interesting people to Berlin. You've been a great Stephen Kellen distinguished visitor.